The Atlantium Mysteries. The Case of the Chemical Explosion. Part 1. How did it all begin, you ask? I must consider a moment. What was the beginning? Was it that inconspicuous Tuesday afternoon when, after several months of being unable to find a suitable roommate, Ezra knocked on my door? Or was it the first time I realized Ezra's strange and singular powers of observation and deduction, that time he told me precisely what I was looking for and where it was to be found, without my having said a word about it? Or was it some time later, when chance or fate could have led one or both of us down a completely different path, but instead brought us here? If there was such a pivotal event, or such a defining moment which so firmly fixed our feet upon this path, I suppose it would be the incident of the chemical reaction. This peculiar and unfortunate episode not only marks the origination of our adventures in investigating and problem-solving, but will also give you insight into how we first came to be involved in the affairs of the Atlantium project. As so many of our initial cases and clients were connected to Atlantium, it is befitting that this Genesis episode should also tell of our initiation into that then secret enterprise. It happens that I did begin at this time to take a few notes of my experience with Ezra, and so shall have in my own written words an aid to assist me in my recalling precisely to you the way in which I experienced this bizarre incident. This is critical, for my experience is very different from Ezra's. He shares and withholds information within parameters I have only, after many years of interaction, begun to guess at. And while no formal introduction may be necessary to you, I should state that the media's representation of Ezra is not on all points entirely fair or accurate. In putting into words Ezra's character and methods, I feel compelled to preemptively say this at least. He is not theatrical, though he can appear to be so. He does not manipulate people and circumstances for egoic recognition, though many have accused him of this endlessly. He is not emotionless, but emotionally well contained. He is not selfish, but he is not selfless. And he is not misunderstood, but he is not by any means understood either. He is controlling and jealous of truth and the way in which he experiences the revealing of that truth. He is the sculptor who does not wish to explain every strike of the chisel to the bystander. He does not wish to expound upon current cause and ultimate end, for he does not yet know himself. He is simply uncovering a bit of marble, a chip at a time, and seeing what is revealed beneath. He knows within that solid block is an absolute truth, but how it will be expressed is his own to both labor upon and to savor. So finally, to you I say only this more. Ezra is man, neither saint nor scoundrel, neither impostor nor impossible. He is simply Ezra Lockwood. I remember laying my head back against the soft leather of the luxury seat in the private jet. The takeoff had been exciting, having been my first experience in a non-commercial airplane. However, once at a cruising altitude, the sight was little different in the four-seater than from any number of commercial flights I had taken in and out of Boston over my several years' residence there. A slight sense of motion sickness was beginning to stir in my stomach, which does not occur to me in larger planes. I thought it may be better to look straight ahead, as one would do in a vehicle upon the ground, so while the patchwork of green and brown fields fled past, 40,000 feet below, I stared forward, beyond the pilot and his controls, to the endless blue ahead. An hour or so into this 3-hour flight, I glanced to my left to see Ezra sitting comfortably reading, his dark, wavy hair thrown carelessly back. It was as though he were still in his favorite chair in our apartment. I admit I was a little annoyed at my own discomfiture and his apparent perfect ease by contrast. But I said nothing about that and instead asked, "Reading anything interesting?" "Would I be reading it if it weren't?" he answered laconically, without looking up. I knew how he was, so didn't press him further. Facing forward again, I closed my eyes and allowed my thoughts to drift back some 12 hours earlier to when Ezra and I had dined with a friend of ours, Jack Hunter, and his father, Mr. Hunter. Jack was actually an old friend of Ezra's from their school days, though I had come to know him well enough over the past year. It seemed in those college years, Ezra had had some experience with Mr. Hunter, for during our meal the older man had said, with a confidential tilt of his head towards Ezra, "You still up to your old game, Mr. Lockwood?" A peculiar comment coming from the serious man, and apropos of nothing, but Ezra took his meaning at once, answering, "It seems I shall always be, sir. It's no more choice for me than breathing." Mr. Hunter chuckled slightly at this, though I remained in the dark. "I understand completely," the older man responded. "It's the same way with me in business. Even as I sit here at this restaurant, I'm thinking, how could it be improved? How could they do the experience for the diners better? How could they increase their profit?" As he spoke, Mr. Hunter looked about himself in a casually intense way, as though his half-lidded, slow-moving gray eyes could easily pierce the facade of the apparatus of the restaurant, and its flaws and merits, its debts and assets, were laid bare before him. "Ah, yes, it's the challenge I live for," he said in his slow way. "A stunted enterprise with great potential." He turned his attention back to us and said with a resigned smile, "Well, it's likely so with most people, and their own little pet interests. At any rate, it seems very fortunate to me to see you again." He suddenly looked more serious and awake than he had seemed the whole meal as he eyed Ezra, his mind thoughtful. "I was just thinking of that little incident with which you helped me before," he said to Ezra. "And it occurs to me you may be helpful to me once more. I can spot a poor business deal, wasted money, corrupt finances, and so on all day. But," he paused suggestively, "but some challenges, Mr. Lockwood, are better met by others." Suddenly Mr. Hunter glanced sharply at me, and said quite frankly, though not to me but rather to his son, "Is this other friend of yours trustworthy, Jack?" "Sure," Jack answered without a moment's pause, "quite as good as Ezra." Jack's eyes flashed me a smile, and I felt pleased to know he thought so highly of me. "Well, he's your friend, so it may be unreasonable to even ask, but you understand, Jack." Jack nodded complete assent. Mr. Hunter again turned to Ezra. "What do you say, Mr. Lockwood? Would you and Mr. Spencer like to hear something very secret, quite perplexing, and holds in it the possible loss or gain of millions?" We said honestly that we would, for my curiosity was certainly piqued, and I knew Ezra had been well baited. "And you swear secrecy?" We again assented, though I was beginning to wonder what I was agreeing to. Mr. Hunter leaned back in his chair, and looking up at the chandelier above the table, began to tell us his story. I will not attempt to relate it in his words, with his own peculiar accent and way of speech, but will simply recount it as I considered it again in that private jet as we flew toward the mystery ourselves. Mr. Hunter explained that some few years earlier, he had bought into a chemical innovation company in his home state of Texas called Atlantium Industries. This company had already patented a couple of fairly lucrative techniques for reprocessing plastic waste before Mr. Hunter had joined the board. These patents kept the lights on and gave the investor some return, Mr. Hunter had said, but he had urged the company to press forward, to dream beyond the immediate horizon. What would people need, what would companies need in the next 5 years, 10 years, that no one had even considered yet? How could Atlantium Industries lead the way to the future? However, it seems the research teams were having difficulty breaking away from processes and materials that connected with plastics recycling. They wanted to use recycled plastics for new clothing material, building materials, for energy, for carbon sequestering. But that had all been done for decades now. That was a highly saturated and competitive market, and Mr. Hunter felt before long these industries would be struggling for want of more plastic waste reserves. The landfills from the start of the century were already half what they had been. The oceans were essentially void of plastic. The shores were clean. The whole system had been upended years ago with these past innovations. The great cities that had sprung up in Africa and South America and India had been built with billions of tons of plastic waste, both as raw material and energy. NAP2 Industries needed to think in a new direction if it was to be the future. Well, it took Mr. Hunter's constant pressing, at least that is his way of telling the tale, for a new scientist on the team to at last suggest something innovative. Her name was Dr. Aurelie Blanchard, and she proposed the future was water. The oceans are cleaner and more abundant with life than they have been for generations. I remember Mr. Hunter saying flatly, as though there was no great accomplishment in this. The coral reefs are exploding with life, and this Dr. Blanchard believed water was the place to be. Aquariums across the world have been pushing limits of glass and acrylic and polycarbonates, building massive curved and convex tanks. The exploration of the deep sea has had a resurgence. Innovators are pushing the boundaries of high-pressure vehicles and research stations, and thousands of square miles of previously unmapped ocean have been surveyed. Indeed, since the establishment of the Harmony Research Base on Mars a few years ago, the zeal for space has dwindled, and people have begun looking to the sea again. Dr. Blanchard thought creating the optimum material or coating for viewing this vast new underwater world was the future for NAP2. Convinced of Dr. Blanchard's proposal, Mr. Hunter and the other members of the board appointed her a team to begin developing in this direction. This was an extremely fortuitous decision for NAP2 Industries because within a year a significant contract was being offered by an investment group to whoever could create the best coating for a new ultra-clear, ultra-strong acrylic. The parameters were extremely specific and difficult to achieve. In essence, the coating was to form a long-lasting barrier against marine buildup, scum, slime, algae, grime, barnacles, essentially all of the unpleasant-sounding growths that immediately set upon anything put into the water. This coating was to last a minimum of 5 years under the rages of the salty ocean and constant wash of the tides, and to be reapplicable underwater. Pressure, at least, was not a great constraint, for the maximum depth was only 30 meters. At the time, very little else was shared with the prospective companies hoping to claim this extremely lucrative contract. The Atlantium project in these earlier stages was very secretive, but it was clear to all that there was a vast amount of investment capital behind the enterprise, and everyone's, including Mr. Hunter's, mouth was watering to get a bite of it. And because of Dr. Blanchard, NAP2 Industries was well ahead of much of the competition. "Well, boys," Mr. Hunter had said to us that night, "we were given 6 months to have something worthy of a demonstration, and those 6 months are up in 2 days. He paused and sighed disappointedly. "Our team finalized our compound a couple of weeks ago. We were ready, but today when Dr. Blanchard went into the lab for a routine test, our perfect mixture blew up in her face." We sat shocked a moment as the older man let the twist sink in. "How is she?" Jack asked eventually. "Will she be all right?" Yes, she's fine," Mr. Hunter said dismissively. "Minor burns, but we are at a complete loss. Everything was done. The material was stable, and now we aren't sure what to do. We aren't the only ones nearing the finish line. There is at least one other company right on our heels, possibly 2, possibly more. This is a very enticing contract, and some people will do wild things when they get desperate." "You suspect sabotage?" I asked incredulously. Mr. Hunter looked at me as though I were being childish. "It's not uncommon, Mr. Spencer," he said. "It's true, John," Jack offered. "I've dealt with a few cases just in the last 12 months. Not just IP theft or infringement, but outright espionage and sabotage, stealing formulas off corporate servers or modifying them to set the teams back. One company successfully delayed the delivery of time-sensitive material by blocking the road with a staged accident. I was surprised at this and looked to Ezra, but he appeared as unperturbed as ever, sitting back in his chair, his face interested but relaxed. There's been a recruiter from another lab hanging about the place, Mr. Hunter went on. He's been talking to some of the staff, trying to buy people off, or at least buy information from what I've heard. Have the police been called in? Have they talked to this recruiter? I asked. Police are aware of the situation, but they don't move very fast, and they aren't very motivated. They couldn't care less about whether Nab2 gets the deal or the other guy down the street. It's impossible to convince them a crime has even been committed. A chemical exploded in a chemical testing lab. That's not very convincing. And that's really the problem, boys. We aren't even sure if there has been a crime committed. The only thing we know is the compound worked fine, and then suddenly it didn't. And nothing should have changed. Ezra now sat forward and said, So, Mr. Hunter, what would you like me to do? Have a look around, Mr. Hunter said quickly. See what you see. We all know you have your own special way of seeing what others are somehow blind to. You found those papers for me all those years ago, and I thought they were assuredly gone. You helped Jack here with that young woman who would have swindled her way right into my will. He chuckled at this, but poor Jack looked uncomfortable. It was an unpleasant memory, but one of my first experiences with Ezra's methods. What do you say, Mr. Lockwood? I'll have you in one of my planes first thing in the morning. Spend a day or two in Houston, see the lab, watch the surveillance footage, and talk to the staff. If there's nothing to see, there's nothing to see. Ezra thought a long moment before answering. What about John? Can he come too? And Jack? They can help me with other people. Mr. Hunter laughed. Sure. Other people can be a bother. I can't, Ezra, I'm sorry. Jack apologized. I've got to be back in the city in the morning. Meetings and a deposition. If only this could have happened last week, it would have been like the old days. Sorry, son, Mr. Hunter said. You can't always schedule corporate sabotage. The demonstration is Tuesday morning. If there's anything to know, we need to know it right away. Well, that was that. Ezra and I accepted this offer, and on the following morning we found ourselves in the aforesaid plane heading to Texas. I had never been to the great Lone Star State. Part 2. We landed at a small regional airport west of Houston that seemed to primarily serve people and companies of Mr. Hunter's status. For all the other planes that were about, whether landing, taking off, fueling, or taxiing, were private luxury jets, most of them larger ones than the one which we had flown in. A waiting car took us from the black tarmac to the shining silver Nab2 Industries facility. The drive took less than 30 minutes, so that by mid-morning, Ezra and I found ourselves being processed through security in the high-tech building. The car had allowed us through the gate, but the moment we stepped out of the vehicle at the front entrance, we had been walked by person from place to place, not once being left alone. This behavior outwardly appeared to be hospitable, and the people were pleasant and willing to engage in small talk, but I knew we were being handled. However, after our identities were confirmed, our passes procured, and the head of chemical engineering, Dr. Vishwakarma, was standing before us, suddenly no one else had any interest in us at all. It was an odd feeling being one moment suspected and the next ignored. I admit I was a bit overwhelmed by it all and began to question if I should have accepted this strange invitation. This was a private and controlled facility with top-grade security protocols and highly suspicious employees. What were we going to discover that these intelligent and diligent people hadn't already? Maybe Mr. Hunter was out of touch with the realities of the companies he had invested in sending a couple of outsiders to poke around where they didn't belong. How was your flight? Dr. Vishwakarma said amiably enough, though it was obvious his mind was preoccupied. Fine, I said. Clear weather. It's hot down here, though. Is this normal for March? We were in a large common area with a few tables and couches. One wall was made only of glass and looked out upon an extensive manicured lawn, beyond which appeared to be a vast park or reserve. Dr. Vishwakarma glanced out of this window and said, "Oh, this is nothing. The heat is just getting started. Come, I'll take you to the lab." He turned to lead us away, but Ezra stalled him, saying, "I understand the lab is monitored continuously. I would like to view the footage of the incident first, please." Dr. Vishwakarma hesitated with a flicker of confusion and frustration on his face. "Well, I suppose that is fine. Come." And with a quick glance at his watch, we started off toward a nearby corridor. Dr. Vishwakarma was a tall, lean man with long legs, and he set a brisk pace, so that I was compelled to follow along by means of an awkward half-jog. Ezra, however, compared to my slightly shorter than average height, is slightly taller and a habitual fast walker, kept up with ease. As we went, I couldn't help but think of the inconvenient intrusion Ezra and I must be to this clearly busy and important scientist. He surely had better things to do than to coddle a couple of friends of one of the board members. I disliked the sense of dissonant superiority and feeling of being resented by a stranger. I had fallen a few steps behind when I heard Ezra ask Dr. Vishwakarma, "I understand Dr. Blanchard is the lead on the team that created this new formula?" "Yes, that's right," Dr. Vishwakarma answered over his shoulder without slowing his pace. "So you are not directly involved with this project," Ezra went on, "but oversee others as well?" "Yes, I am the head of about 12 different projects right now," Dr. Vishwakarma answered. "But D112 has been a top priority for some months. I have worked not only directly with Dr. Blanchard and the team, but also with the liaison for the contract and creating the final presentation, which now that Dr. Blanchard is not here, I have just learned I will be giving." He spoke with the air of one who was overworked and underappreciated. "What are the incentives for excellence at this facility?" Ezra asked, ignoring the doctor's frustrated tone. Dr. Vishwakarma slowed at the oddity of the question and looked with consternation at Ezra. "What do the scientists and engineers and developers and so on receive for performing well?" Ezra explained further. "What does Dr. Blanchard get, let's say, if her idea wins this contract?" "She gets to keep her job. She gets to continue innovating in her cutting-edge laboratory. She gets to do what she loves," Dr. Vishwakarma said with some heat. "Yes," Ezra said undeterred, "but does she receive a bonus, or pay increase, or special trip, or anything?" Dr. Vishwakarma stopped walking, and turning to face Ezra said, "This is not a solo project. Innovation is a team effort. The success of one project must pay for the failure of hundreds of others. You think in a very mean and selfish way, Mr. Lockwood. Where would the world be if everyone thought as you do?" Completely disaffected by this response, Ezra coolly smiled and said, "I have often wondered that." Evidently uncertain what that response meant, Dr. Vishwakarma turned and set off again, if possible walking even faster. The complex was not massive, but it was, well, complex, and after an elevator ride, several long hallways, and passing through a handful of restricted doors, we eventually arrived at the monitor room. The finish and shine of the place had diminished by degrees as we passed through each door, so that we found ourselves now in a comparatively utilitarian section. However, despite the lack of soft materials and natural lighting, it was clear no expense had been spared in the equipping of this room. From the crisp displays, the high-tech workstations, the humming processors, and even to the blinking servers, which I could just glimpse through a glass door at the far end of the room. Everything was sleek, slim, and glossy aluminum or carbon fiber or crystal-clear graphene. "James," Dr. Vishwakarma called to a young tech at a workstation across the room. The tech looked up at us, his red hair prominent in the monochromatic space. Seeing Dr. Vishwakarma waving him over, he stood and came toward us. There were only 4 or 5 people in the room, but I remember thinking this James seemed like an odd choice to assist in this important and urgent problem, as he appeared to be both the youngest tech there and the furthest from us. As we waited for James to cross the room, Ezra asked Dr. Vishwakarma, "Can our passes get us through the doors we just came through?" The doctor thought a moment. No," he said. "Not the one we just came through." "Can James here let us out then?" Ezra went on. "As I'm sure you have other more pressing business, and I would like to take my time here. We can return when we are ready to see the lab." James was now standing among us as Dr. Vishwakarma said, "But you won't know the way." I chuckled at this, which must have seemed impertinent, but as Ezra quickly repeated the exact route we had taken, including lengths and durations for each walk, James too laughed. "Wow," he said with his southern enthusiasm. "That was something else. I didn't know that hallway was 40 feet and took 15 seconds to walk." Dr. Vishwakarma, who like most people would have never considered this recall possible, was stumped a moment, but then after another glance at the clock on the wall seemed to disregard it and said dismissively, "Whatever, fine. James can send me a message when you leave. I'll meet you at the west elevator." He turned to James. "These men would like to see the footage of Dr. Blanchard's accident yesterday. Assist them and let them out when they are ready. And send the message as well." He spoke even as he was heading for the door. "Oh, absolutely, Dr. Vishwakarma," James responded obediently. The door opened, Dr. Vishwakarma turned and added an acerbic comment. "Mr. Hunter sent them, so I guess they are supposed to have access to whatever they want." The door closed. Struck by the rudeness of this departing remark, I wondered if I would myself have behaved in the same way had I been in Dr. Vishwakarma's position. As I turned to complain to Ezra, I saw his indifferent expression already turning away, and asking the bewildered James which display they would be using. "Right, the tech answered as he looked around. This station here will be fine." As James drew up chairs for us, I introduced Ezra and myself. "Nice to meet you," he said in his personable way, and then, taking up his command at the console, began working, typing and swiping, until he soon had the recording up on the graphene screen before us. The timestamp must have been logged, because almost at once we saw a researcher, Dr. Blanchard, I assumed, her yellow hair in a tight bun, white lab coat buttoned up, and safety glasses on, step up to a lab bench. She was about my age, early 30s, and very attractive with fine features. A flask was on the lab bench, and she held another in her right hand. From the 3 angles we had, the whole room was visible, and we could also see through the windows along one wall to an office beyond. Dr. Blanchard was raising the flask in her hand and pouring it into the one on the bench. Immediately, there was a flash of red and yellow light. She screamed and fell back, the held flask shattering on the floor. The flask upon the lab bench was spewing flames, though they were rapidly diminishing. Dr. Blanchard pressed herself up from the floor and flung the flaming mixture down the nearby sink and flicked on the faucet. I suspected that wasn't a good idea, and my concern was immediately confirmed as a fresh plume of flames erupted from the stainless steel sink. Scrambling back, Dr. Blanchard then grabbed the nearby extinguisher attached to the lab bench itself and sprayed the flames desperately. An intermittent alarm was wailing out, but we could still hear her panting and spraying the chemical extinguisher in the intervals between the blaring sounds. And then, suddenly, it was all over. The flames were out, and Dr. Blanchard dropped the extinguisher and crumpled to the floor. She heaved for breath and cried, leaning against the opposite lab bench, her knees drawn up and her face crimson already with the burn. In that moment, I had a strange sentiment come over me. She had been by herself in the lab the whole time, but when curled up and crying on the floor, I realized for the first time she looked alone. I felt very sorry for her, and I felt that it was wrong for us to look on at this private scene of misery. Yet even as I sat there feeling embarrassed and pitying Dr. Blanchard, I heard Ezra say quite coolly, "Again, please, James," as though what we had seen wasn't real or was of no consequence. Even after having known Ezra for a couple of years at this point, I was still quite shocked at his callousness. James, too, was apparently rattled, for he did not immediately respond, but then, shaking himself, he said, Sure, okay." "And take it back a bit further," Ezra added. "How long had she been in the room?" James scrubbed back the recording, and we saw the catastrophe in rapid reverse. Dr. Blanchard then stepped back from the bench and returned the contents of each flask to their respective containers in different parts of the lab. Then, after removing her glasses and unbuttoning her lab coat, she walked backwards out of the room. She had just come in, I said, surprised. That's right, James answered. Play it forward from here, Ezra said. We watched Dr. Blanchard enter, don the white coat, put on the glasses, and after collecting the two components separately, she was again stepping forward to mix them. I wanted to say out loud, "Don't do it." She added the mixture, and the chaos followed. At the third viewing, Ezra requested the recording slowed down. I simply couldn't imagine why he wanted to see her agony and fear at a crawl. But just after Dr. Blanchard had poured the mixture, he said, "That's enough. Is there a camera in her office there?" He pointed to the windows on the wall of the lab, through which the office space could be seen. "Yes," James answered. "We have one in there," and he quickly brought up another view. "Scrub back until she enters," Ezra requested. Dr. Blanchard came back from the lab in reverse, and, after leaving the coat and glasses at a little station near the door, she walked backwards past several of the desks to sit at her own workstation. "You can go faster," Ezra said. James scrubbed back more quickly. "Do you know how long she was in her office?" I asked. James shook his head, but suddenly she popped up from her seat and left the room. "Bring it forward again, please," Ezra said. "Normal speed." Dr. Blanchard walked into the office and, going directly to her desk, sat before her computer. Unlike the transparent graphene screen we were looking at, her display had a solid back, but she appeared to be working, for she was quite still and staring forward. She hadn't yet put her hair in the tight bun, and I saw it was very long and very lovely, a bright gold, and it framed her delicate face pleasingly. And I again felt the sense of unease and impropriety of invading this woman's privacy. The recording may be company property, but I felt certain she never suspected a lot of strangers would be watching her every move. "My supervisor and the security director, well, and a bunch of other people I don't know, already went through all of this," James said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "They watched every minute of every feed we have, going backward from the explosion yesterday to last Friday. They didn't find anything." "Nothing suspicious at all?" I asked. "Nothing on the recordings. There's a back door near the loading dock. Somebody found it was unlocked, but there's a couple of security doors between there and the lab, but nobody's on the recording coming that way anyhow. Also, I think they said there was a guy hanging out Friday afternoon, just off the main foyer of the building. Kinda off to the side. Suspicious looking, I guess. Seemed to move in and out of the camera blind spots. But that's empty space except for a supply closet, which is also locked. We have cameras on all the doors and elevators and stairs. He didn't go anywhere." "Nobody knows who he was?" I asked. Ezra was still fixated on the recording and didn't seem to be giving James any attention. "Oh, I don't think so," James said. "Well, honestly, I'm kind of the least informed guy here. The security director, Mr. Anders, called in most of the security team first thing this morning, even people that weren't scheduled to work today. They had a meeting in the conference room across the hall, and then everyone left." "All of them?" My voice showing my surprise. "As far as I know, following up with some idea, I guess. I heard there was a poacher from a competitor trying to get in with some of the researchers. Maybe they were trying to find out more about him." "And the lab ran a successful test Friday?" I questioned. "Yeah, everything was fine," James confirmed. "She's just working, Ezra," I said to him. "Are you ready to go see the lab yet? We will be talking to Dr. Blanchard later this afternoon. You can ask her herself what she was doing if you're so interested." He didn't respond, but continued watching and asked James, "Why is she the only one there?" "Well, it was a Sunday. Well, the place was empty this weekend. It's unusual. They've been working really long hours and most weekends, so I think they were all happy to get a break. And then this happens." "Ah," Ezra said and went on watching. Dr. Blanchard now began winding up her blonde hair into the bun. Once finished, we saw her take a bottle out of her bag and begin applying lotion. "What's with women and always putting on lotion?" James asked. She sat a little while longer, and I was getting pretty annoyed with Ezra, when she at last rose and headed for the lab. Okay, Ezra decided. Message Dr. Vishwakarma, please. John, let's go see the lab. James sent the message and said, I'll let you guys out of here. Did a paramedic or emergency worker enter the lab? Ezra asked as we were walking toward the outer door. I'm not really sure, James answered. I wasn't here that day, and I haven't watched the recording beyond the accident. But I doubt it. The company has its own emergency medical staff on site, and there's supposed to be someone here at all times, even through the weekend. It would have taken an outside team forever to get through security. It would have been easier to have walked her out. He opened the door and we went through. They would have made even emergency personnel go through security? I asked disbelievingly. I wouldn't be surprised, he said, and then with a, well, good luck, guys, he closed the door. Thank you for listening to the Atlantium Mysteries. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and consider sharing it with a friend and rate and review it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more and to connect with this project, you can find us on most social platforms by searching for the Atlantium Mysteries and on our website www.theatlantiummysteries.com. For information, suggestions, promotion, and reproduction, please send an email directly to hello@theatlantiummysteries.com.